Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. This session is on what is grammar translation method. Well, my dear students, for a student of language teaching methods, it is very crucial and very important to understand the nature of each of the common methods that are being used for language teaching across the world. And it is very important to go through them one by one. This particular session focuses on grammar translation method, and I expect and hope that by the end of this session, you would be able to understand the practices related to grammar translation method as well as the strengths and weaknesses of grammar translation method. Well, my dear students, methods and approaches may differ in their theoretical background. What does it mean? It means, as I hope you know, that every method has some concepts or some beliefs or some ideas behind that, which we may call theory or theories that operate behind a method. So theories or concepts, when they are translated into practices in a classroom, we call them method or methods. There are different perspectives, there are different ideas or beliefs regarding teaching and learning of a language, and thus teaching and learning of English language as well. So there are varied methods and there are varied approaches and theories behind them. Their focus and goals, views on teacher and learners' roles, typical techniques and forms of interaction, attitude to errors and the use of mother tongue, role of instruction materials, etc., they also differ. From one method to the other, from one theory behind one method to another theory behind yet another method, or from one approach behind a method to another method. All these things, which include, the role, the belief in terms of the role of the learner, in belief in the nature of learning, belief in the role of the teacher, the techniques that are used, the forms of interaction that take place between the teacher and the learner, and the use of mother tongue, etc. Even the instructional materials and the nature of those materials that are used, they differ from one to the other. It is very difficult, and in fact, it is almost impossible to say which one is the best one, which one is the worst one. Actually, we cannot categorize them in that way. Each of them has its own strengths, weaknesses, have its own opportunities related to it, and has various threats related to it, what we may call SWOT analysis. So we can look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats related to each of them, and thus we can see how any method can be exploited in a situation or can be used in a particular situation for teaching and learning of a language. Well, as far as the grammar translation method is concerned, it is a method of teaching foreign languages derived from the classicals, sometimes called the traditional languages. So the method is also traditional, and it is based on the method of teaching Greek and Latin languages. In fact, grammar translation method is aimed at analyzing and studying the grammatical rules of language. Now, when we look at the practical application of how it is being taught in the classroom, in any language classroom, we also need to understand the theoretical perspectives behind that. And the theory behind that aims at analyzing and studying the grammatical rules of languages, since it believes, the theory believes that by learning the structures of a language, the learner can learn the language. So in order to, in an order roughly matching the traditional order of the grammar of Latin, any new language would be looked at. English would actually be looked at. This is how the case was in the past. Then it focuses to practice manipulating grammatical structures through the means of translation both into and from the mother tongue. So the teacher moves to and fro between the first language, between L1 and between L2, the mother tongue. And what is the purpose of the teacher? By using L1 as a source, enabling the learner to learn the linguistic structures, to understand the linguistic structures of L2. This method is very much based on the written word, and texts are widely in evidence. Now, there are two important aspects in this regard. One, it is more based on the written texts than on verbal communication, than on oral communication, than on oral interaction. It is more based on writing. So if we, for example, look at the Pakistani school system, where grammar translation method is used, if you ever observe such a classroom, you would notice that almost all the activities that are carried out in the classroom are writing-based activities. And texts are widely in evidence. Now, because it is writing-based, because it believes in the accuracy of the structures of language, because it believes in learning the structures of the new language or the target language through matching and comparing it with the structures of the already learned language, already known language, that is L1. Because of all these factors, texts are widely used. So it is not incidental, it is not accidental, it does not happen through the classroom activity process on the random basis. Rather, it is very much structured, and it happens through selected texts. And it is very interesting that most of the times the texts that are used, they are literary texts. They are not communicative texts. So if you pick up any book that is used in Pakistani public sector schools for teaching of English language, you know, these textbooks are based on literary texts, on stories and on poems, and on extracts from literary texts. They are not communicative texts. A typical procedure is to present the rules of a particular grammatical item. So, for example, if the teacher, and this is what you can observe in a typical Pakistani English language teaching classroom in the rural areas or in the public sector schooling as well, where, for example, if the teacher wants to teach a structure, a linguistic structure that involves present perfect tense in English, the teacher would give its Urdu equivalent. For example, wo khana kha chuka hai. This kha chuka hai then would be equated with the present perfect tense, and the teacher would try to show a kind of similarity between the structures, or would create a kind of matching or similarity between the structures, and would expect then the learners to understand it in relation to their experience of this particular structure in L1. Then it is used to illustrate its use, including the item several times in a text. And then, of course, repeatedly this item is used, and practice using the item through writing sentences and translating it into the mother tongue. So, you know, for example, in typical Pakistani English language classroom, the teacher would give certain words, a list of say 5 words or 10 words to the students, and the students would be asked to make sentences using those words. And of course, these sentences would be created in isolation. They would not be created in any communicative context. In grammar translation classes, students learn grammatical rules and then apply those rules by translating sentences between the target language and the native language. Advanced students may be required to translate whole texts word for word. And actually, if we look at our own examination practices in Pakistani schools, in the matriculation board examination and in the intermediate board examination, we find that an extract is given where the students are expected to translate it from English to Urdu or from Urdu to English. Overall, I would say that the method has 2 goals: to enable the students to read and translate literature written in the source language, and to further students' general intellectual development. So if you look at the 2 goals, to be able to read the literary texts and to have a general intellectual development, These two roles clearly indicate that developing communicative competence, that developing the ability to communicate or interact in the target language is not at all a goal. The result of this approach is usually an inability on the part of the student to use language for communication, which I think is something very natural in this context. Thus, GTM does not focus on context, so communication skills of the learners remain poor.